over Mark 4:35 through 6:13. And the major themes in this section are fear and faith. Mark likes to group stories together thematically at times. And so we get a whole bunch, earlier on we had a whole bunch of stories about conflict between Jesus and his opponents. Now we're getting, and then we got a bunch of stories in parables. Now we're getting a bunch of stories about faith in particular and the importance of faith, but also the way in which fear comes as a hindrance to faith. So let's look at this first story, which is Mark 4:35 through 41. And that's the story of the stilling of the storm. So, Jesus and his disciples are going across the Sea of Galilee, and a great windstorm arose in verse 37. The waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. Okay, now what's Jesus doing in the midst of all this? Is he bailing water? Is he manning the sails or something? No, what's he do? He's asleep on the stern. He's not worried about it, but the disciples are worried about it. They're like, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing?" And so Jesus wakes up, he rebukes the wind, and he says, "Peace, be still." And then there's a dead calm after that. Then he says something important to the disciples. He says, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" So what Jesus is doing here, you see, is he is placing faith and fear in opposition to one another. Think of faith in this case as being like trust. Okay, so if they trusted in Jesus as their benefactor, and that's kind of how they would think of Jesus, as a benefactor or as a patron, in this patron-client world, which you are reading about in Honor Among Christians. Having trust in Jesus means that they shouldn't be afraid, but they still are. And part of it is because they don't understand who Jesus is. So in verse 41, they were filled with great awe, and they said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They don't understand who Jesus is, and so they don't understand what he's able to do for them or how he's able to provide for them. Now in 5:1 through 20, we get a very long and detailed story about the Gerasene demoniac, and we're only going to be able to hit a few of the high points in this story. But they go to Gerasa, which is in modern-day Jordan, and in the town of Jerash, and they encounter a man there who is living among the tombs. It says in verse 3, no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. Night and day, in verse 5, night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. Okay, so he's living in a way that's entirely self-destructive. He's hurting himself, he's naked, he's living among the tombs, and then when he sees Jesus, like he immediately knows who Jesus is. The demons in Mark have a spiritual perception where they understand Jesus in a way that people don't. It doesn't mean that they have faith in Jesus. As it says in James, even the demons believe and tremble. So these demons believe. And John Wesley said you could be as orthodox as the devil and just as much a stranger as he to the true religion of the heart. So demons believe in who Jesus, they know who Jesus is, they understand who Jesus is, but they regard Jesus as their enemy. And so when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For Jesus had said to the man, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Okay, Now, Jesus is having none of this. The guy says, don't, just leave us alone, Jesus, okay? And Jesus says, well, what is your name? And I imagine that, would have been regarded as a way of gaining power over the demon, to know the name of the demon. And the demon says that his name is Legion. The demon, I suppose, can't help but tell Jesus what his name is. And in Legion, the name Legion expresses not only how many demons there are, but how powerful they are. A demon was 6,000 Roman foot soldiers, or excuse me, a legion was 6,000 Roman foot soldiers. The Roman legions were feared throughout the ancient world. And some commentators have suggested that what this is really actually kind of a metaphorical and coded message about resistance to the Roman Empire. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think this really is that what Mark wants us to understand is that Jesus confronted demons. Jesus' primary enemy is Satan, and Jesus has come to destroy the works of Satan. Mark basically tells us this in the story where Jesus tells the parable about the binding up of the strong man. And so there is, there's the legion, a great many and powerful demons called Legion, and they asked Jesus to send them into swine. And for Jewish people didn't raise pigs, and they would not have wanted to be around pigs. They would not have wanted to touch pigs, and so pigs are not well regarded by them. And Jesus says, okay, fine, go into the pigs, and they do. But remember that the kind of behavior that the demon has been compelling this man towards is self-destructive behavior. That Jesus leads to life, but the demonic leads to death. And so the man was living, naked among the tombs, hurting himself. And now when these demons go into the pigs immediately rush into the lake to their death. The works of the devil lead to death. Now, the swineherds, see this, and they're like, holy smokes, and they go and they try to tell people what happened. And then when the people come back, this possessed man, this man who had been possessed, is now sitting there. He's clothed and he's in his right mind, and he's, a normal guy again. And they're like, what happened here? And so they don't know, for one thing, their reaction is a reaction of fear. Okay, they don't know how Jesus did this. They don't understand what God he represents. You remember, these aren't people who worship the God of Israel, and they don't know who the true God is, and so they don't understand who Jesus represents, and they don't understand his power, and they're fearful. But there could also be another reason for their fear, and that is whoever owned these pigs just lost a huge amount of money. 2,000 pigs the guy lost, and so this is a huge amount of money, and so people may not want to. The people may fear Jesus for that reason as well. They don't respond in faith to Jesus. They ask him to leave. They're afraid. They respond in fear. But the man whom Jesus healed does respond in faith, and he becomes an evangelist for Jesus. We get what's called a sandwich story. A more technical term is intercalation. It's the story of the healing of Jairus' daughter. And sandwiched in the middle of that is the story of the healing of the woman with a hemorrhage. Okay, so Jairus is a synagogue leader, and he comes to Jesus and he begs Jesus. He responds to Jesus in faith because his daughter's dying. There is a certain sense in which desperation leads us to faith, and that's what we see here. His little daughter is dying, and he's afraid. And he begs Jesus to help. And Jesus is like, great, let's go. I want to help. And so they immediately go. But on the way, they get interrupted. Okay, now there are crowds around Jesus, as you would expect, because Jesus has gained a reputation as a healer and as someone who can cast out demons. But there's a woman there who has had um, perpetual menstrual bleeding for 12 years. And what this means is that she can't interact with people out in normal society. She can't function as a normal member of society. You know, apart from the significant just health problems that she would have, she's not able to interact with her family and friends in a normal way anymore. Um, One is simply, you know, the obvious problems of ongoing menstruation, but the other one would be that she is um, unclean all the time. Now, Jewish people, you know, in this era, most of them weren't obsessed with cleanliness. They would have been ritually unclean most of the time, but there were times when you did want to be ritually unclean. This woman could never get that way, though, and whatever she touched, whatever she set on, would have the effect of providing contamination to other people who were ritually clean. And so she couldn't interact with people in normal ways, and she's desperate. Again, this is someone who's desperate, who's coming to Jesus for help. And Jesus does want to help her, but she touches his clothes without him knowing. I mean, it is an act of faith where she touches his clothes without him knowing, and the power comes out of Jesus, and she's healed immediately, but he knows what happened. So he turns around, he says, you know, who touched me? The disciples are like, Jesus, are you crazy? Everyone's touching you. But someone touched Jesus for a purpose, and that purpose was to be healed. And the woman came to him, how? In fear and trembling. Jesus says to her that she doesn't need to be afraid. You know, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. So again, we see a juxtaposition between fear and faith. Now then Jesus and Jairus keep going, but people come to Jairus and say, your daughter has died. But what was Jesus say? Do not fear, only believe. And in truth, she, you know, I mean, it looks like from the story that she had died. But Jesus is able to raise the dead. And so Jairus kept going with Jesus. Jairus, maybe he was afraid, but he still responded in faith. He was still obedient to Jesus. And as a result, Jesus healed his daughter. As we move into chapter 6, we get the story of the rejection of Jesus at Nazareth. Here again is a case where people do not respond to Jesus in faith, but in this case it's not fear that causes them not to respond in faith. It is an honor-shame issue, and they see Jesus as taking more honor than he deserves. We know who this guy is. We grew up with him. This is Jesus from down the street, and so they think that Jesus is grasping at honor, and so they reject Jesus, and as a result of, you know, he's astounded at their lack of faith, and as a result, it's hard for him to perform miracles in their midst. And finally, you know, he sends out the 12, beginning in 6-7, and he sends them out in a way that does require faith. I mean, they might have been nervous about this, as it says in verse 8, he ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts. Okay, they do get to wear sandals, thank goodness, but not to put on 2 tunics. I would have been like, Jesus, I'll leave the staff at home, but I would rather take bread, you know. And Jesus is forcing them to have faith in his instructions, that they're not going to starve, that they're going to be okay, that they're going to travel from town to town. And here's a case where the disciples actually are obedient. They actually do what Jesus says. They don't always do that. But it says they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick, and they cured him. So they were faithful to Jesus to good result. And you know what Mark wants to teach us here is that when we respond to Jesus in faith, God empowers us in those times to do the work of the kingdom.